Morning, everyone. I am very excited this morning to be kicking off our new series looking at the book of James. And we're thinking about the book of James with the title Faith Works. Faith Works. And so each week we're taking a chapter from the book of James. And so I'm looking today at chapter 1 of James. There's some Bibles coming around in due course. If you haven't got one with you, grab one of those. The words will also appear on the screen as we read through the chapter as well. Not the whole chapter today, but I will be doing a bit of an overview of the whole chapter for you as we look at it. And now there's a bit of debate around James as to who exactly this James is. You know, we talk about the book of James, and it's a letter that's written by someone called James, and a bit of a debate about who that person is. But most people land on saying, you know, this guy was the brother of Jesus. The brother of Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but that must mean he's got some stories to tell, doesn't it? In terms of the way that what he's seen and what he's grown up with in and through his life. And so it's fascinating, really, as we look at this book to see exactly what it is that James wants to say. I don't know if you were the brother of Jesus, what you might be tempted to pick up on and say. But I find it fascinating the way in which James starts his letter here, because he says this. He says, James, that's himself, introducing himself, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. To the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. I don't know how it is that you would kind of kick off an introduction to yourself, who you are if you were the brother of Jesus. But here's how James chooses to do it. He describes himself as a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that word servant, doulos, you could also translate that as slave. He introduces himself, this James, as the slave of God and of his Lord Jesus Christ. He emphasizes his subservient status before the people to whom he writes. And of course, he writes there to the 12 tribes scattered. In other words, kind of all Jews who follow Jesus in dispersion. And so as James is writing there, he introduces himself in that way. Now, when Peter left Jerusalem to plant new churches, he needed someone to kind of leave in charge, if you like, of the Jerusalem, the church, the mother church. And James was the one who rose to prominence amongst those very early Christians as someone who led that Jerusalem church. And we know that that was a church that fell on really hard times whilst he was its leader. We know that it was a church that experienced and lived through famine, through poverty, through persecution. And through it all, we read elsewhere in the New Testament that James is described as a pillar of the church. Through very difficult circumstances, he was known as a pillar of the Jerusalem church and a peacemaker until his untimely death as a martyr in about AD 62. And this letter that we're looking at, the book of James, works very differently to many of Paul's letters. Because when Paul is writing a letter, very often we see that Paul is writing this letter to a church or a group of churches to address some specific problems or issues that they're experiencing. And it doesn't appear as if James is writing in quite the same way. Rather, it acts like, if you like, James drawing upon his sage wisdom and his years to ask a key question. And the question that he is asking, I think, is what does a truly wise life look like? What does a truly wise life look like? And it's clear for James that he has been influenced by at least two main things in his life, and as he draws upon this in his letter. He's clearly drawing upon the life of Jesus as he reflects on this letter. I don't know if you're on a website where you're kind of familiar with this, that you see various hyperlinks all over the place, don't you, when you're reading a web page. And as you're reading down a web page, you might have a link that goes off to explain, perhaps a link to a Wikipedia page or something that explains a bit more detail behind the concept or the idea that's being explained. It might be a bit of evidence to back up what you're saying that's linked to out of that website. It might be that what it's doing is kind of giving you a bit of a joke or a bit of a kind of a look back to more detail. And I think if the book of James were being written today in kind of a web page form, there'd be hyperlinks all over the place. And if you were following those hyperlinks, there'd be two main places that it would take you. The first one would be hyperlinking back to the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave. There's loads of references through the book of James to Jesus' teaching, especially the Sermon on the Mount. But there's another place that is continually referenced throughout the book of James, and that's particularly the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. And if you've ever read Proverbs, there's all sorts of allusions in the book of James to Proverbs. And much like Proverbs, you can be reading this letter and you can be struggling a bit with what the structure of the letter is. And because it doesn't appear like there's a very clear structure to it at all. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do all these different ideas that James is throwing out link to one another? What's the kind of common thread that's going through it all? And perhaps what the main thread that's running through is this issue of wisdom. What does it look like to live a wise life? And yet, at times, it can feel as if the structure is a bit all over the place. And that's led some people to refer to this perhaps as being a sermon. I don't know why they would have thought that, potentially, but it perhaps was an early sermon by James to his disciples. There's no obvious structure. But what it does do is it points to what it looks for us to live a whole life. What it looks like for us to live a life of integrity, of wholeness, a life of true wisdom. And so as we look through the first chapter of James, very helpfully, what it does is it gives us an overview of many of the key themes and ideas throughout the book of James. Because there's 12 kind of main things that James says through the book. And the first chapter, if you like, gives us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the issues and ideas that James is picking up on here. And so the first thing we see in the first sort of 2 verses or so, first 4 verses or so, is this. How should we respond in trials? And James here talks about the trials that we experience in our life. And he says, rather than there being something to run away from, the trials that we experience in life can actually be, if you like, paradoxically, a real blessing in our lives. And James here talks about how there's something about the gift of trials results in, for us, perseverance. It results in endurance for us. And James says, God can do amazing work in our lives through trials. And in fact, they can make us, it says in verses 2 to 4, mature and complete. Mature and complete. Your translation might use the word, rather than mature, it might talk about, help us to become perfect. Now, the word that's being used there is one that James then continually repeats throughout the book of James. It appears 7 times throughout the book of James about what it means for us to become mature, what it means for us to become perfect. And that word refers to that sense of wholeness, of integrity, of the sense in which our words and our speech, our actions, the way we think, live up to and marry up to what we believe. That we are one person. For many of us, we can, if you like, find ourselves as far from that, being fractured people. We know that the things we say, the way in which we live, doesn't always match up to what we believe. It doesn't always have that same impact. That here, we know we can be, if you like, one writer puts it like this. He says, we can be spiritually schizophrenic. We can almost, we can believe one thing, but actually what we do and what we say and how we live is quite different. And yet, James goes on to point to the need for wisdom. And he says, God is about bringing into your life healing and wholeness, integrity, true wisdom. That as we live out that wisdom in our lives, we find that place of wholeness. God is on a mission to restore fractured people, and that begins with wisdom. Verse 5 says, ask for wisdom from God. And James makes the point there that actually as we experience his wisdom, God's wisdom in our lives, it enables us to view our circumstances from a different position, from a different place. It might be one of the trials that you're going through is the same that James points to here. He says actually it might be one of the trials that can be brought in our lives is that of poverty, of lack of money. And James points here to that, and he says, actually, when you have the wisdom from above, that gives you an ability to see your circumstances from a very, very different position. Now, of course, we've got to remember that for James writing here, it can be very easy for us to kind of look on and kind of look at some financial difficulties we might have and think that we are poor. Of course, in a kind of global context, we're anything but poor. But James here says, actually, if you think yourself in poverty, see things differently. Actually see the poverty that you have as an opportunity for God to be at work. And in these verses, in verses 9 to 11, he talks about, perhaps actually your poverty is a gift. Is a gift that's forcing you to recognize the good things that God has done and forces you to trust in God alone. And he talks here about wealth being something that is fleeting, that lasts only for a time, just as the flowers in the field are kind of there one day and gone the next, withered away. Wealth in our lives is like a withering flower, here one day, gone the next. And he says, real wisdom in your life is choosing to recognize the benefits that you've got, that God can bring to you in the midst of your circumstances. Money, or perhaps the lack of money, can be one of the greatest tests for Christians. Money, I believe, can be an idol for you. An idol for you, whether you've got it or whether you haven't got it. And in fact, at times, I know I can speak personally here, that actually it's when I've not got it, sometimes I'm thinking more about that thing I've not got. And it becomes more of an issue for me. I want that new kitchen, or whatever it might be, and I spend all my time thinking about that new kitchen that we want. It becomes something for you that can become an idol in your life and can rob you of fullness of life. Here, James says, we want nothing to get in the way of our wholehearted devotion to God. What does wisdom look like? It looks for you like looking at your circumstances from a different vantage point, seeing things how God sees them, recognizing that what God brings into our lives are gifts for us to be able to thrive and to grow. And so James goes on then to talk about remembering what Jesus has taught us. And so I want us to think through particularly verse 19 and beyond. So let's just read this together. If you've got your Bibles, turn with me to James chapter 1, and we're going to read from verse 19 together. Obviously, the words are on the screen there. So James says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that's so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. And anyone who listens to the word but does not do it, what it says, is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they've heard but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who can consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after the orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Kind of tough, kind of straight-hitting word there from James. And, it's perhaps worth pointing out that, James here is one of those books that has been a bit controversial through time. And you may be familiar with these words from Martin Luther, guy on the screen there. Good-looking chap, as you can see. He described the book of James as being an epistle of straw. And he seriously argued that actually the book of James should take a secondary kind of position. When we're reading through the New Testament books, it should be of secondary importance to other more important books of the Bible. And partly kind of what was behind that for him was the importance that he placed in his own life and in the writings that he had around the centrality, as he saw it, of justification by faith alone. Being saved not by what we do, but by our faith in Jesus as a freely given gift from God. And because of partly the passage we've just read and all sorts of things through the book of James, he said, I'm not quite sure how this kind of chimes with this idea of justification by faith, because the James is talking about what you do. And actually, I believe it's about the gift of God, the gift of faith. So it's had a bit of a rough outing amongst many. But for many, many believers, the book of James is an incredibly popular one. And there's lots of good reasons for that. It's an intensely practical book. An intensely practical book. And it's concise. It kind of doesn't hang about. You've gathered from the verses we've just read that actually it kind of jumps from idea to idea and doesn't hang around in making its point. It's very blunt. And James here is often drawing on metaphors and allusions to make his point. He talks throughout the book, tons of metaphors and allusions. He talks about the kind of the rough seas and the waves of life. He talks about the withering flower and the image of a face in the mirror that we just read there. He talks about the tongue being like a bit in the horse's mouth. He talks about a rudder's ship, a destructive forest fire. He draws upon the idea of spring waters and of an arrogant businessman, of corroding metal. And he talks about moth-eaten clothes. He uses all these kind of metaphors that help us to apply what he's saying to our own lives, just like the book of Proverbs often does for us, to think about that and to look at how those things apply to our lives. And James here, in the passage we read, is making a central point that we need to not only be hearers of his word, we also need to put it into practice in our lives. We need to apply it, to do it in our own lives. Now, not to kind of give any kind of ammunition to this at all. I went around my house this morning, in fact, to look at various things that I have and use infrequently. Now, you might not be able to kind of see what's on the screen there, but that is my bedside drawer. And inside that bedside drawer, you might just be able to make out a brown inhaler. Now, I have asthma. But I think I'm what my wife would describe as a non-compliant patient. Every year, around this time, I get a bit of a cough. And it lasts, and it lasts, and it lasts. I can never get rid of it. I blame PGCEs for this. I did a PGCE, got a cough, never went away. And every time I find myself going to the asthma nurse and describing my symptoms, and they're always asking me, are you taking your brown inhaler? And of course, the truth is, I'm not. I start to take my brown inhaler when I start to feel like I need it. But of course, if you know anything about kind of asthma and brown inhalers, that I know very little about, but from what I understand, you have to keep on taking your brown inhaler, even when you're feeling okay. You keep on taking that brown inhaler. I'm non-compliant. I do not apply that to my life. I take it when I think I need it, and it does me not as much good as perhaps it should do. Another one. Who's got one of these? This is our garage. And you might be able to make out there quite a few paint pots. I don't know about you, but I was looking at some of these paint pots this morning, and I'm pretty sure some of them are about 15 years old. They're relevant for paint that's no longer even on our walls. And yet somehow we still manage to kind of keep them there. And you sort of, you have a little look inside, and you think, there's no way I'd be applying that to my walls. Often we can approach our faith in the same way. As Christians, you might sort of find yourself thinking, well, I've heard lots and lots and lots and lots of talks. I've read my Bible lots and lots and lots of times. But actually, very often, we can find ourselves being consumers of good illustrations and good thinking, and yet we fail to really apply that to our lives. And in that regard, it's almost as kind of useless as paint in a pot. Paint is there to be applied to the wall, isn't it? That's when it starts to do some good. It's there to be applied in our lives. And James here talks about the importance of doing. Not just hearing his word, but applying it to our lives. My smelly running shoes. I've got a bit better at running recently, thankfully. I've been doing a bit more. By God's grace, I've been picking up the old running again. But a few years back, in fact, it was 2014, I went to buy some new running shoes. I don't know if you've ever had this kind of, but I went to one of those running shops. They have such a thing. And I had a gait analysis done. And what it means is you kind of run on this treadmill and they video you running. And after about 2 minutes, I had enough. I was kind of happy to get off, thank you very much. But they did this whole kind of gait analysis and then proposed a very expensive pair of running shoes that I might like to buy as part of that. And I happily parted with my cash for these shoes. Those shoes then sat in my drawer back home for about 3 or 4 years. I use them occasionally, but they didn't get much use. And for us, we might buy ourselves, they're not quite so swanky actually, but a swanky pair of running shoes. But actually the thing that does us good is putting them on and not just kind of feeling good about having our shoes on, but actually going out and running. And in fact, the more we run, the more we go out and do that, the more we realize we need to go out to run more often because it does us good. It's good for us to do those things. Joshua spoke last week, looking at the book of Joshua, about marginal gains in our lives. And the way in which we see marginal gains in our life is by putting into practice what we hear and what we see. It's about not just hearing, but it's about doing. I just want to raise that as a question for you this morning as we kick off this series looking at the book of James. For you to think through, what is it, what truth is it in my life that waits to be applied? What is it that I know is true? And yet I choose to keep it as head knowledge and not to apply it in my day-to-day life. What truth waits to be applied? You know, the more running you do, the more you recognize your need to do more running. The same is not true for DIY, by the way. I just want to make that point very clearly. DIY is never a good thing. But the more you do, the more you recognize the need to do it. And actually, it's only when the rubber hits the road in our lives and we choose to put into practice what we're hearing and live it out that we recognize the need for God to come in and help us out. We need his wisdom, his way of doing things, if we're going to be successful in applying that to our lives. And James here makes the point of someone who looks in a mirror and immediately forgets what they look like. You know, it's interesting for us in our lives. We perhaps spend more time looking in the mirror than we do looking into ourselves and recognizing that we need to change who we are on the inside. You know, perhaps we're more committed to fixing the things that don't really make that much of a difference, when actually there's things in our lives that we need to apply that make all the difference. And here, James picks up on that theme, and he says, okay, you want to apply this to your life. What does that look like? You know, give me a hat to hang this on. What does it look like? And he uses a word that's very unpopular for many of us these days. He talks about people who are religious. You don't like to be religious, do you? He talks about people who have religion. And he perhaps uses that word religious or religion in a purposefully very broad way. You know, if you're here today and you in any way consider yourself to be religious, this one's for you. If in any way you're interested or looking to apply this to your life, then you are in this category of religious. And he picks up on that. And James says, you know, anyone who claims to have a genuinely kind of religious experience should submit themselves to some tests in blue there. You know, what is it that waits to be applied in our lives? James reels three things off really quickly in that passage. Verses 26 and 27 of James chapter 1. He says, you want to apply this to your lives? Here you go. How do you speak to other people? Do you speak with love? What is it those noises that are made by your tongue? Do you speak with love? Secondly, do you serve the poor? Do you serve the needy around you? Because if you're applying this to your life, you would be. You know, just to pick up on Luther again, and before him, Augustine, they described sin as humanity that's curved in on itself. There's something about sin in our lives that causes us to look only at ourselves. And Augustine, and after him Luther, picked up on that idea, and they said actually there's something about sin that causes us to be wrapped up in ourselves. And yet as we're opened up to the freedom that God brings, it opens us up to look out from ourselves, firstly to God, and importantly, secondly, to those around us. And so James here says, well, how do you speak? Are you outward? Are you looking out from yourself toward the needs of others? And then lastly, are you polluted by the world? That kind of language that he uses is quite interesting. You know, in other words, are you wholly devoted to God alone? And James says the wise life. What does it look like to live wisely? It looks like watching what you say. It looks like helping those around you. It looks like avoiding being messed up by a world that messes things up very easily. And he says, focus on those first two. Think about how you say things and who you say it to. Look for opportunities to help others and to serve the poor. And avoid getting messed up in the process by this messy world. Focus on those first two and avoid the third one, and you'll be on the right track. There's a brilliant set of videos done by the Bible Project, and on these verses, they say this. Those verses kind of serve like a punch to the gut for all of us. And it might be that you're here today and you wouldn't describe yourself as a follower of Jesus. And in which case, this is ammunition for you to look at the person who brought you here and to say, But before you're too quick to do that, I would challenge you. Now, the book of James is, you can feel free to pick and choose. If you're here and you don't follow Jesus, take any of this and with a pinch of salt and decide to take some of it away if it's helpful to you. But I would challenge you. Doing this is harder than just saying it. Living it in our lives is tough. And as we seek to do that, as followers of Jesus, we recognize the need for Jesus' wisdom, for his life, for his power, and also for his grace to enable us to live truly wise lives. And it's as we try and do this stuff, and it's as we come into the trials of life, that we need to go back to God and ask for his wisdom, for his grace, for his life, that we can put this stuff into practice. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be thinking about the book of James. And some of the themes that we picked up on there kind of will be repeated again in the coming weeks, not least that one about putting things into practice that Ed's going to be thinking about next week with us. But I want to leave you with that challenge. What truth needs to be applied to your life this morning? What is it that for you hear and you process in your brain, but actually you know you need to actually do something about? And I'd encourage you in the coming week to seek out friends who you can be honest with, who you can say, look, I really struggle with this stuff. I'm really struggling with this. Will you help to keep me accountable as I try and live differently? It might be someone in your small group. It might be a prayer triplet that you're part of or should be part of one. It might be with a significant other in your life when you just ask them to say, look, I'm trying to do this. Will you help to keep me honest as I seek to live the wise life that James urges us to live?